Hello and welcome to our post-budget recording. Over the next 15 minutes, we are going to be taking a look at today's announcements, the first Labour budget for 14 years and Rachel Reeves' debut with the small red case. And we're going to focus in on three areas that have really grabbed our attention today. Now, I am Greg Mullins, Head of Advisor Solutions here at Brooks Macdonald, and I'll be acting as your host. And I am delighted to be introducing our expert commentator, Sir Steve Webb. Steve was Minister of State for Pensions for a 5-year period from 2010 through to 2015, where he oversaw some significant reforms for state pensions, including auto-enrolment and pension freedoms. Over the last 4 years since leaving that role, Steve spent time at Royal London, during which in 2017, he received his knighthood. Steve then in 2020 joined LCP, a leading consultancy practice specialising in many areas, but in particular, investments, pensions and insurance. Steve, welcome.
Greg, thank you very much. It's nice to take a few moments away from the small print of the budget documents to join you this afternoon.
I bet you've been extremely busy, so thank you very much for finding the time to join us. Listen, let's get straight into it, Steve, if that's okay. What I'd love to do is just start with a real sort of top-line view from what you've heard today, and then really sort of these three areas that really maybe have stood out for you.
Sure. And I mean, there are so many announcements. I mean, the speech went into a second hour. I mean, we'd got past the first hour, and I'm sure she said finally about 6 times, but there's an awful lot to digest. And there were billions of pounds flying all over the place. But I thought what it might be useful to focus on, first of all, is some of the pension changes, obviously a subject of concern to both of us. Then look a bit at some of the tax changes on things like capital gains tax. And then finally look at the big ticket change, the £25 billion increase in employer national insurance, which will filter its way through the economy in all sorts of different ways. So perhaps if we focus on those 3 topics, Greg?
Absolutely. I'm surprised private jets didn't make it into the top 3, Steve, but away you go.
Lovely. Well, I mean, I suppose the first thing is there was a lot that didn't happen on pensions. So you always get the rumours in the run-up to the budget. Is higher rate income tax relief going to be scrapped? Well, no. Were tax-free lump sums going to be capped? No. Were national insurance contributions going to be put on pensions? No. So a lot of the things that could have happened didn't. So I suppose we should be grateful for that. But one thing that we'd written about and others that speculated on is that did happen is that pensions, so unspent pension pots and certain death benefits are going to be included in the estate for inheritance tax. So until now, or indeed until 2027, when the changes come in, if I, for example, were to die and leave some money in drawdown to my children, they could have inherited it free of inheritance tax. It would have been excluded from inheritance tax. That is now going to be included. So potentially up to 40% of that money will now be subject to inheritance tax. And I guess my initial reaction to that is that people will want to think calmly and carefully about what that means for their financial planning. It's never a good idea to rush these things. But for example, some people will have kept money in pensions precisely because they weren't subject to inheritance tax. They may now want to think about whether there are other ways that money could be held outside the IHT net. They might want to actually get some money out, give it to the children, because as long as you survive for 7 years, IHT doesn't apply. Obviously, there's income tax implications of that. Some people I've read today have already said, well, I did a defined benefit transfer partly because I knew the money was safe from IHT and now it isn't. I need to revisit my plans. So my sense, Greg, is that that's one of the big pension changes. And in these early days of the announcement, we're all crawling over the small print. And indeed, there's a consultation just been launched on exactly how this will work. So at the moment, even the government doesn't know precisely how it will work, but certainly there's going to be a lot for savers and for their advisors to get their teeth into.
Absolutely. And I mean, aside from the pension, Steve, what was the next sort of thing that really grabbed you?
Well, there had been a lot of language before the budget about how taxes wouldn't rise on, working families and all that sort of thing. And obviously taxes have risen substantially on employers, but also on wealth. So obviously we just talked about inheritance tax and other changes there on things like agricultural relief and so on. And obviously capital gains tax was another big one, with the main rates of capital gains tax going up. And I suppose something that people will want to think about is there has always been of late that difference in tax rates between taking things as income, taking things as capital gains. that balance has shifted as a result of these changes that have been announced today. And so again, people will want to review if they've structured their savings, their investments to maximise capital gains tax breaks, and those breaks and those capital gains tax rates aren't as favourable as they were. Well, does that mean any review to your position? And again, these tax changes, unlike things like in the past, it was fill up your tank with petrol before 6 o'clock because the change was imminent. Obviously, these changes are going to take a bit of time to come through. So people, I think one message from today is people have got time to take advice, time to think. But certainly, if you've made a set of decisions based on the current tax rules, they may well want to be revisited now that the balance between different taxes has shifted.
Absolutely. So pensions moving into IHT, CGT. Anything else really grab you?
Well, I suppose it's very hard not to ignore the elephant in the room of a £25 billion raise in national insurance. And when you're involved in pensions, you get a bit blasé about billions. But if employers have got to find £25 billion, that's going to come from somewhere. So although, tomorrow morning, next month, our pay packets won't change because of that, there'll be a lot of knock-on impacts. And in a way, businesses don't ultimately pay taxes. It's their shareholders, it's their workers, it's their customers who will ultimately pay. So some firms will pass this on and we'll see higher prices in the shops. Some firms will say to their workers, well, we can't afford that pay rise we were planning, or we can't afford such generous pension provisions, so there may be changes there. And obviously, if you've got shares in a company that's got a big national insurance bill increase, obviously their profits are potentially going to be hit, so we might see that ultimately in the markets, and obviously that may take time to work through. So I think, it's one of those where governments can tax businesses and nobody really notices, and all the gainers and losers tables in the newspapers tomorrow won't show any impact whatsoever of a £25 billion tax rise. But sure as eggs is eggs, it's going to work its way through the system somehow, and that's clearly what we need to look out for.
And that in turn will impact on markets and various asset classes, asset instruments, absolutely, as the ultimate destination. Well, any of the bits you've mentioned, what was the sort of biggest surprise for you, Steve?
Yeah, there had been some speculation, I think. I mean, what happens within government is that the government tries to manage expectations a lot. So they had raised expectations that the freeze on the income tax personal allowance, which is due to go on at least till April 2028, might go on for another couple of years. So they clearly laid a false scent. And so the Chancellor could then say in a speech, well, it's been rumoured that this might happen, brackets, because we briefed out that it might. But I'm not going to do that. Unlike the last lot, I'm not going to do that. So there's a bit of political theatre, I suppose. But it is, I guess, good news for people who are being dragged into the basic tax net or dragged into higher tax bands because of these freezes, that the Chancellor gave the impression that those freezes would end, albeit not till 2028. So we've got a few more years of pain yet. So I think that was one where we were laid a false scent, and that was put to rest. I would have expected petrol duties to go up, and they didn't. So at least temporarily, with some respite there. I must admit, I filled my car with petrol just on the off chance, but that didn't happen. And I think often the devil is in the detail on these things. So we've studied the paper. I know at Brooks Macdonald you're going through in the small print what all of this means. And some of this will only come out in the next day or two, because sometimes chancellors actually don't even mention in speeches measures which are in the budget. And that might sound surprising. You might imagine, well, perhaps they have to. There's no rule that says they have to. So it's always wise to follow the money, to look at the taxes where the money's coming from. And going back to where we started, the inheritance tax and pension change will raise over £1 billion a couple of years after it's been implemented. It will affect, they reckon, about 1 in 12 of all estates. So that's quite a significant change. So we'll carry on crunching the numbers, but certainly there's a lot of change, I think, as you'd expect at the start of a new government, and therefore a lot for people to, over time, in a kind of measured and steady way, review their financial plans and not assume that what was right yesterday is going to be right tomorrow.
Absolutely. And with the changes that we've talked about, as you've just mentioned there, Steve, these will actually reach an awful lot of people, ultimately through retirement, through IHT, in these sorts of areas. I think it's kind of the final point is kind of what should people be thinking, or what should people be doing next. And I think you've already framed that perfectly. That there's an awful lot of column inches to be written. There's a lot of words to be looked at, and in fact, consultation papers to be written and issued for us to really get to grips with that. I think. Sorry, Steve.
No, I was just going to say, and I think you make the point very well that the impact of these measures is unique to each individual. And to just give you one very simple example, inheritance tax, if I pass money on to my spouse, there is an exemption for transfers between spouses. But if we're unmarried, there isn't. And so with nearly 1 in 4 couples in Britain today living together outside marriage, today's measures, including pensions and inheritance tax, will have a much bigger impact on people who are not married than on people who are or in civil partnerships. So that's just one example where you can't assume that changes don't apply to you. It really is a matter of understanding the detail, or obviously talking to someone who's had a chance to burrow into all of that, and make sure that your financial plans take account of all these latest changes.
Listen, well, thank you very much. I mean, at Brooks Macdonald, we are long-term advocates of people receiving financial advice. It can have very positive consequences on their financial outcomes. And absolutely, I think from us, I think that key message is, reach out, receive financial advice, make sure that, the personal implications are understood. And certainly when working with somebody like Brooks Macdonald as an investment specialist, working with that financial planner with our own clients, we find adds a huge amount of value, because it really adds a huge amount of relevance to what the clients are going to receive. Steve, thank you so much for joining us on what I'm sure will continue to be a very busy day and 48 hours for you. Thank you, everybody who's dialed in or has listened to this, and hopefully we'll speak to you all again soon.
Thanks very much, Greg.
Thanks, Steve.